Welcome, everyone. Wherever you are, whatever the time is, it's obviously bedtime. And I, of course, am obvious. I'm glad to have you here. I hope you all had wonderful holidays, even though they were probably a little different than most years. I know my cousin and I were commiserating about how weird and off the holiday was. Hey, Sparky, glad to see you. Hey, Vela. But yeah, talking about how quiet everything was and how it was strange to just have a few people instead of the big groups we were used to. I'm glad you liked the music. We went back to the I uploaded a vid for what? Hello, little dude. Glad to see you. Did you have a good holiday? That's odd. I wonder why that is. Is it from today? Because it was a little weird. When I started the stream, there were a couple minutes to go, but it didn't actually show up on Twitch until it was like 50 seconds left or something like that. Very strange. Let's take a look at that. That is odd. Okay. It says broadcasting now. That might be like a placeholder for this current recording. We'll take a look after we conclude this storytime session and see what it says. If it's got 2 for today or just the 1. Might just be a little bit glitchy. Who knows? In any case, Conan. Let's see, where were we with Conan? He had determined that the jewel that the thief had transported was the heart of Ahriman, and that he needed that to save his kingdom, and put together the rather obvious clues from the witch. I believe he headed into the neighboring country that was a bunch of kind of warring fiefdoms, and there was a fortress that acted sort of as a bandit camp, sort of as a toll booth on the road, and they had actually captured the merchant that Conan was chasing and had tortured him, and the merchant tricked the leader of the bandits into poisoning himself to death. Whereupon the second in command of the bandits seized the jewel and took off out across the land, the desert or whatever it was, and ended up dying in the next town. I'm not sure I remember much past that. Am I missing any important details? Do you guys remember? It's been a little bit since we read Conan, since we took that break for holiday stories. Yep. Oh, right. That's absolutely correct. The ship stole the jewel and took off, and then Conan got shanghaied, and then took over the ship and came back out as his Abra, the Corsair persona, and took command of the vessel and used the weapon shipments in the hold to equip the crew. Well, the former galley slaves who were now his crew. That's right. Thank you for reminding me. I had forgotten that part. That is an important detail. I'm very glad you reminded me of it. All right. Well, we'll read some Conan here in just a minute. Catch up with what's going on the ship and with the voyage and the chase. And see if he captures. I'm glad you loved it. That's good. I'm glad you've been enjoying it. All right. Well, unless anybody has some quick questions for 8 Ball, I'll go ahead and do my transitions and we'll get started with the story. So we're on chapter 16, Black-Walled Kimmy. The venturer swept southward like a living thing, her oars pulled now by free and willing hands. She had been transformed from a peaceful trader into a war galley, insofar as the transformation was possible. Men sat at the benches now with swords at their sides and gilded helmets on their heads. Shields were hung along the rails, and sheafs of spears, bows, and arrows adorned the mast. Even the elements seemed to work for Conan now. The broad purple sail bellied to a stiff breeze that held day by day, needing little aid from the oars. But though Conan kept a man on the masthead night and day, they did not sight a long, low black galley fleeing southward ahead of them. Day by day the blue waters rolled empty to their view, broken only by fishing craft, which fled like frightened birds before them, at the sight of the shields hung along the rail. The season for trading was practically over for the year, and they sighted no other ships. When the lookout did sight a sail, it was to the north, not the south. Far on the skyline behind them appeared a racing galley with full spread of purple sails. The men urged Conan to turn and plunder it, but he shook his head. Somewhere, south of him, a slim black galley was racing toward the ports of Stygia. That night, before darkness shut down, the lookout's last glimpse showed him the racing galley on the horizon, and at dawn it was still hanging on their tail, afar off, tiny in the distance. Conan wondered if it was following him, though he could think of no logical reason for such a supposition, but he paid little heed. I wonder if it's those 4 weird guys that were dispatched to hunt him down. Where are they from? Kitai, if I remember right? Some sort of sorcerers. Each day that carried him farther southward filled him with fiercer impatience. Doubts never assailed him. As he believed in the rise and set of the sun, he believed that a priest of Set had stolen the heart of Ahriman. And where would a priest of Set carry it but to Stygia? The men sensed his eagerness and toiled as they had never toiled under the lash, though ignorant of his goal. They anticipated a red career of pillage and plunder and were content. The men of the southern isles knew no other trade, and the Cushites of the crew joined wholeheartedly in the prospect of looting their own people, with the callousness of blood ties meant little, a victorious chieftain and personal gain, everything. Soon, the character of the coastline changed. No longer they sailed past steep cliffs with blue hills marching behind them. Now the shore was the edge of a broad meadowlands, which barely rose above the water's edge and swept away and away into the hazy distance. Here were few harbors and fewer ports, but the green plain was dotted with the city of the Shemites, green sea lapping the rim of the green plains, and the ziggurats of the cities gleaming whitely in the sun, some small in the distance. Through the grazing lands moved the herds of cattle, and squat broad riders with cylindrical helmets and curled blue-black beards, with bows in their hands. This was the shore of the lands of Shem, where there was no law save as each city-state could enforce its own. Far to the eastward, Conan knew, The meadowlands gave way to desert, where there were no cities, and the nomadic tribes roamed unhindered. Still, as they plied southward, past the changeless panorama of city-dotted meadowland, at last the scenery began to alter. Clumps of tamarind appeared. The palm groves grew denser. The shoreline became more broken, a marching rampart of green fronds and trees, and behind them rose bare, sandy hills. Streams poured into the seas, and along their moist banks vegetation grew thick in a vast variety. So at last they passed the mouth of a broad river that mingled its flow with the ocean, and saw the great black walls and towers of Kimi rise against the southern horizon. The river was the Styx, the real border of Stygia. Kimi was Stygia's greatest port, and at that time her most important city. The king dwelt at more ancient Luxor, but in Kimi reigned the priestcraft, though men said the center of their dark religion lay far inland in a mysterious, deserted city near the bank of the Styx. This river, springing from some nameless source far in the unknown lands south of Stygia, ran northward for 1,000 miles before it turned and flowed westward for some hundreds of miles, to empty at last into the ocean. The venturer, showing no lights, stole past the port in the night, and before dawn discovered her, anchored in a small bay a few miles south of the city. It was surrounded by marsh, a green tangle of mangroves, palms and lianas, swarming with crocodiles and serpents. Discovery was extremely unlikely. Conan knew the place of old. He had hidden there before, in his corsair days. As they slid silently past the city, whose great black bastions rose on the jutting prongs of land which locked the harbor, torches gleamed and smoldered luridly, and to their ears came the low thunder of drums. The port was not crowded with ships, as were the harbors of Argos. The Stygians did not base their glory and power upon ships and fleets. Trading vessels and war galleys indeed they had, but not in proportion to their inland strength. Many of their craft plied up and down the great river, rather than along the seacoasts. The Stygians were an ancient race, a dark, inscrutable people, powerful and merciless. Long ago their rule had stretched far north of the Styx, beyond the meadowlands of Shim, and into the fertile uplands now inhabited by the peoples of Koth and Ophir and Argos. Their borders had marched with those of ancient Acheron, but Acheron had fallen, and the barbaric ancestors of the Hyborians had swept southward in wolfskins and horned helmets, driving the ancient rulers of the land before them. The Stygians had not forgotten. Sorry, just pouring my tea. Drinking Darjeeling today with some honey. All day the venturer lay at anchor in the tiny bay, walled in with green branches and tangled vines, through which flitted gay-plumed, harsh-voiced birds, and among which glided bright-scaled, silent reptiles. Toward sundown, a small boat crept out and down along the shore, seeking and finding that which Conan desired, a Stygian fisherman in his shallow, flat-prowed boat. Thanks, Panda. They brought him to the deck of the venturer, a tall, dark, rangily built man, ashy with fear of his captors, who were ogres of that coast. He was naked except for his silken breeks, for like the Hyrcanians, even the commoners and slaves of Stygia wore silk, and in his boat was a wide mantle, such as these fishermen flung about their shoulders against the chill of the night. He fell to his knees before Conan, expecting torture and death. "Stand on your legs, man, and quit trembling," said the Cimmerian impatiently, who found it difficult to understand abject terror. "You won't be harmed. Tell me but this. Has a galley, a black racing galley returned from Argos, put into Kimi within the last few days?" "Aye, my lord," answered the fisherman. "Only yesterday at dawn, the priest Thutothums, I think that's right, Thutothums, Thutothmes, returned from a voyage far to the north. Men say he had been to Mysantia." What did he bring from Messantia? Alas, my lord, I know not. Why did he go to Messantia? Demanded Conan. Nay, my lord, I am but a common man. Who am I to know the minds of the priests of Set? I can only speak what I have seen and what I have heard men whisper along the wharves. Men say that news of great import came southward, though of what, none knows. And it is well known that the Lord Thutothumes put off in his black galley in great haste. Now he is returned, but what he did in Argos, or what cargo he brought back, none knows, not even the seaman who manned his galley. Men say that he has opposed Thothamon, who is the master of all priests of Set, and dwells in Luxor, and that Thutothumes seeks hidden power to overthrow the Great One. But who am I to say? When priests war with one another, a common man can but lie upon his belly and hope neither treads upon him. Sounds like the proverb about the elephants in the grass. When elephants fight, the grass suffers. Conan snarled in nervous exasperation at this servile philosophy, and turned to his men. I'm going alone into Kimi to find this thief, Thutothumes. Keep this man prisoner, but see that you do him no hurt. Crom's devils, stop your yowling. Do you think we can sail into the harbor and take the city by storm? I must go alone. Silencing the clamor of protests, he doffed his own garments, and donned the prisoner's silk breeches and sandals, and the band from the man's hair, but scorned the short fisherman's knife. The common men of Stygia were not allowed to wear swords, and the mantle was not voluminous enough to hide Conan's long blade. But Conan buckled to his hip a Ganada knife, a weapon borne by the fierce desert men who dwelt to the south of the Stygians, a broad, heavy, slightly curved blade of fine steel, edged like a razor, and long enough to dismember a man. Then, leaving the Stygian guarded by the corsairs, Conan climbed into the fisherman's boat. Wait for me until dawn, he said. If I haven't come then, I'll never come, so hasten southwards to your own homes. As he clambered over the rail, they set up a doleful wail at his going, until he thrust his head back into sight to curse them into silence. Then, dropping into the boat, he grasped the oars and sent the tiny craft shooting over the waves more swiftly than its owner had ever propelled it. Chapter 17. He has slain the sacred son of Set. I'm guessing that priest is about to have a bad day, from the chapter title. The harbor of Kimi lay between two great jutting points of land that ran into the ocean. He rounded the southern point, where the great black castles rose like a man-made hill, and entered the harbor just at dusk, when there was still enough light for the watchers to recognize the fisherman's boat and mantle, but not enough to permit recognition of betraying details. Unchallenged, he threaded his way among the great black war galleys, lying silent and unlighted at anchor, and drew up to a flight of wide stone steps which mounted up from the water's edge. There, he made his boat fast to an iron ring set in the stone, as numerous similar craft were tied. There was nothing strange in a fisherman leaving his boat there. None but a fisherman could find a use for such a craft, and they did not steal from one another. No one cast him more than a casual glance as he mounted the long steps, unobtrusively avoiding the torches that flared at intervals above the lapping black water. He seemed but an ordinary, empty-handed fisherman, returning after a fruitless day along the coast. If one had observed him closely, it might have seen that his step was somewhat too springy and sure, his carriage somewhat too erect and confident for a lowly fisherman. But he passed quickly, keeping in the shadows, and the commoners of Stygia were no more given to analysis than were the commoners of the less exotic races. In build, he was not unlike the warrior caste of the Stygians, who were a tall, muscular race. Bronzed by the sun, he was nearly as dark as many of them. His black hair, square cut, and confined by a copper band, increased the resemblance. The characteristics which set him apart from them were the subtle differences in his walk, and his alien features and blue eyes. But the mantle was a good disguise, and he kept as much in the shadows as possible, turning away his head when a native passed him too closely. But it was a desperate game, and he knew he could not long keep up the deception. Kimi was not like the seaports of the Hyborians, where types of every race swarmed. The only aliens here were the Shemite slaves, and he resembled them as he resembled the Stygians themselves. Strangers were not welcome in the cities of Stygia, tolerated only when they came as ambassadors or licensed traders, but even then the latter were not allowed ashore after dark. And now there were no Hyborian ships in the harbor at all. A strange restlessness ran through the city, a stirring of ancient ambitions, a whispering none could define except those who whispered. This Conan felt rather than knew, his wedded primitive instincts sensing unrest about him. If he were discovered, his fate would be ghastly. They would slay him merely for being a stranger. If he were recognized as Amra, the corsair chief who had swept their coasts with steel and flame. An involuntary shudder twitched Conan's broad shoulders. Human foes he did not fear, nor any death by steel or fire. But this was a black land of sorcery and nameless horror. Set, the old serpent, men said, banished long ago from the Hyborian races, yet lurked in the shadows of the cryptic temples, and awful and mysterious were the deeds done in the nighted shrines. He had drawn away from the waterfront streets, with their broad steps leading down to the water, and was entering the long, shadowy streets of the main part of the city. There was no such scene as was offered by any Hyborian city, no blaze of lamp and cressets, with gay-clad people laughing and strolling along the pavements, and shops and stalls wide open and displaying their wares. Here, the stalls were closed at dusk. The only lights along the streets were torches, flaring smokily at wide intervals. People walking the streets were comparatively few. They went hurriedly and unspeaking, and their numbers decreased with the lateness of the hour. Conan found the scene gloomy and unreal. The silence of the people, their furtive haste, the great black stone walls that rose on each side of the street. There was a grim massiveness about the Stygian architecture that was overpowering and oppressive. Few lights showed anywhere except the upper parts of the buildings. Conan knew that most of the people lay on the flat roofs, among the palms of artificial gardens under the stars. There was a murmur of weird music from somewhere. Occasionally, a bronze chariot rumbled along the flags, and there was a brief glimpse of a tall, hawk-faced noble, with a silk cloak wrapped about him, and a gold band with a rearing serpent-head emblem confining his mane, of the naked charioteer bracing his knotty legs against the straining of the fierce Stygian horses. But the people who yet traversed the street on foot were commoners, slaves, tradesmen, harlots, toilers, and they became fewer as he progressed. He was making toward the temple of Set, where he knew he would be likely to find the priest he sought. He believed he would know Thutotham's if he saw him, though his one glance had been in the semi-darkness of the Mesantian alley. That the man he had seen there had been the priest, he was certain. Only a cultist high in the mazes of the hideous black ring possessed the power of the black hand that dealt death by its touch. And only such a man would dare defy Thothamon, whom the Western world knew only as a figure of terror and myth. Hey Meg, thanks for the lurk. The street broadened, and Conan was aware that he was getting into the part of the city dedicated to the temples. The great structures reared their black bulks against the dim stars, grim, indescribably menacing in the flare of the few torches. And suddenly he heard a low scream from a woman on the other side of the street, and somewhat ahead of him, a naked courtesan wearing the tall, plumed headdress of her class. She was shrinking back against the wall, staring across at something he could not yet see. At her cry, the few people on the street halted suddenly as if frozen. At the same instant, Conan was aware of a sinister slithering ahead of him. Then about the dark corner of the building he was approaching poked a hideous, wedge-shaped head, and after it flowed coil after coil of rippling, darkly glistening trunk. The Cimmerian recoiled, remembering the tales he had heard. Serpents were sacred to Set, god of Stygia, who men said was himself a serpent. Monsters such as this were kept in the temples of Set, and when they hungered, were allowed to crawl forth into the streets to take what prey they wished. Their ghastly feasts were considered a sacrifice to the scaly god. The Stygians within Conan's sight fell to their knees, men and women, and passively awaited their fate. One, the great serpent would select, would lap in scaly coils, crush to a red pulp, and swallow as a rat snake swallows a mouse. The others would live. That was the will of the gods. But it was not Conan's will. The python glided toward him, its tension probably attracted by the fact that he was the only human in sight still standing erect. Gripping his great knife under his mantle, Conan hoped the slimy brute would pass him by. But it halted before him and reared up horrifically in the flickering torchlight, its forked tongue flickering in and out, its cold eyes glittering with the ancient cruelty of the serpent folk. Its neck arched, but before it could dart, Conan whipped his knife from under his mantle and struck like a flicker of lightning. The broad blade split that wedge-shaped head and sheared deep into the thick neck. Conan wrenched his knife free and sprang clear as the great body nodded and looped and whipped terrifically in its death throes. In the moment he stood there staring in morbid fascination, the only sound was the thud and swish of the snake's tail against the stones. Then, from the shocked votaries burst a terrible cry. "Blasphemer! He has slain the sacred son of Set! Slay him! Slay! Slay!" Yeah, him and Indiana Jones. No liking the snakes. Except Conan just kills them and, Indiana Jones kind of cowers like a little girl. Or at least like a little child. Stones whizzed about him, and the crazed Stygians rushed at him, shrieking hysterically, while from all sides others emerged from their houses and took up the cry. With a curse, Conan wheeled and darted into the black mouth of an alley. He heard the patter of bare feet on the flags behind him. I mean, right now we're talking about a giant serpent who goes out and randomly kills people in the streets because it's hungry. And is sacred to a dark god that, likes to enslave entire nations. Stones whizzed about him, and the crazed Stygians rushed at him, shrieking hysterically, while from all sides others emerged from their houses and took up the cry. With a curse, Conan wheeled and darted into the black mouth of an alley. He heard the patter of bare feet on the flags behind him, as he ran more by feel than by sight, and the walls resounded to the vengeful yells of the pursuers. Then his left hand found a break in the wall, and he turned sharply into another, narrower alley. On both sides rose sheer black stone walls. High above him he could see a thin line of stars. These giant walls he knew were the walls of temples. He heard behind him the pack sweep past the dark mouth in full cry. Their shouts grew distant, faded away. They had missed the smaller alley and run straight on in the blackness. He too kept straight ahead, though the thought of encountering another of Set's sons in the darkness brought a shudder from him. Let's not eat the peoples. Then, somewhere ahead of him, he caught a moving glow, like that of a crawling glowworm. He halted and flattened himself against the wall and gripped his knife. He knew what it was, a man approaching with a torch. Now it was so close he could make out the dark hand that gripped it, and the dim oval of a dark face. A few more steps, and the man would certainly see him. He sank into a tigerish crouch. The torch halted. A door was briefly etched in the glow, while the torchbearer fumbled with it. Then it opened, the tall figure vanished through it, and darkness closed again on the alley. There was a sinister suggestion of furtiveness about that slinking figure, entering the alley door in darkness, a priest perhaps returning from some dark errand. But Conan groped toward the door. If one man came up that alley with a torch, others might come at any time. To retreat the way he had come might mean to run full into the mob from which he was fleeing. At any moment they might return, find the narrower alley, and come howling down it. He felt hemmed in by those sheer, unscalable walls, desirous of escape, even if escape meant invading some unknown building. The heavy bronze door was not locked. It opened under his fingers, and he peered through the crack. He was looking into a great square chamber of massive black stone. A torch smoldered in a niche in the wall. The chamber was empty. He glided through the lacquered door and closed it behind him. His sandaled feet made no sound as he crossed the black marble floor. A teak door stood partly open, and gliding through this, knife in hand, he came out into a great, dim, shadowy place, whose lofty ceiling was only a hint of darkness high above him, toward which the black walls swept upward. On all sides, black arched doorways opened into the great, still hall. It was lit by curious bronze lamps that gave a dim, weird light. On the other side of the great hall, a broad, black marble stairway, without a railing, marched upward to lose itself in gloom, and above him on all sides dim galleries hung like black stone ledges. Conan shivered. He was in the temple of some Stygian god, if not Set himself, then someone barely less grim. And the shrine did not lack an occupant. In the midst of the great hall stood a black stone altar, massive and somber, without carvings or ornament, and upon it coiled one of the great sacred serpents, its iridescent scales shimmering in the lamplight. It did not move, and Conan remembered stories that the priests kept these creatures drugged part of the time. The Cimmerian took an uncertain step out from the door, then shrank back suddenly, not into the room he had just quitted, but into a velvet-curtained recess. He had heard a soft step somewhere nearby. From one of the black arches emerged a tall, powerful figure in sandals and silken loincloth, with a wide mantle trailing from his shoulders. But face and head were hidden by a monstrous mask, a half-bestial, half-human countenance, from the crest of which floated a mass of ostrich plumes. In certain ceremonies, the Stygian priests went masked. Conan hoped the man would not discover him, but some instinct warned the Stygian. He turned abruptly from his destination, which apparently was the stair, and stepped straight to the recess. As he jerked aside the velvet hanging, a hand darted from the shadows, crushed the cry in his throat, and jerked him headlong into the alcove, and the knife impaled him. Conan's next move was the obvious one suggested by logic. He lifted off the grinning mask and drew it over his own head. The fisherman's mantle he flung over the body of the priest, which he concealed behind the hangings, and drew the priestly mantle about his own brawny shoulders. Fate had given him a disguise. All Kimi might well be searching now for the blasphemer who dared defend himself against a sacred snake. But who would dream of looking for him under the mask of a priest? He strode boldly from the alcove and headed for one of the arched doorways at random, but he had not taken a dozen strides when he wheeled again, all his senses edged for peril. A band of masked figures filed down the stair, apparelled exactly as he was. He hesitated, caught in the open, and stood still, trusting to his disguise. The cold sweat gathered on his forehead and the backs of his hands. No word was spoken. Like phantoms, they descended into the great hall and moved past him toward a black arch. The leader carried an ebon staff which supported a grinning white skull, and Conan knew it was one of the ritualistic processions so inexplicable to a foreigner, but which played a strong and often sinister part in the Stygian religion. The last figure turned his head slightly toward the motionless Cimmerian, as if expecting him to follow. Not to do what was obviously expected of him would rouse instant suspicion. Conan fell in behind the last man and suited his gait to their measured pace. They traversed a long, dark, vaulted corridor in which Conan noticed uneasily the skull on the staff glowed phosphorescently. He felt a surge of unreasoning, wild, animal panic that urged him to rip out his knife and slash right and left at these uncanny figures, to flee madly from the grim, dark temple. But he held himself in check, fighting down the dim, monstrous intuitions that rose in the back of his mind and peopled the gloom with shadowy shapes of horror. And presently he barely stifled a sigh of relief as they filed through a great double-valved door which was 3 times higher than a man and emerged into the starlight. Conan wondered if he dared fade into some dark alley, but hesitated, uncertain, and down the long dark street they padded silently, while such folk as they met turned their heads away and fled from them. The procession kept far out from the walls. To turn and bolt into any of the alleys they passed would be too conspicuous. While he mentally fumed and cursed, they came to a low arched gateway in the southern wall, and through this they filed. Ahead of them and about them lay clusters of low, flat-topped mud houses and palm groves, shadowy in the starlight. Now, if ever, thought Conan, was his time to escape his silent companions. But the moment the gate was left behind them, those companions were no longer silent. They began to mutter excitedly amongst themselves. The measured ritualistic gait was abandoned. The staff with its skull was tucked unceremoniously under the leader's arm, and the whole group broke ranks and hurried onward. And Conan hurried with them, for in the low murmur of speech he had caught a word that galvanized him. The word was Thutothums. Chapter 18. I am the woman who never died. I kind of feel like that's most women, right? Most women have never died. I know, I've certainly never died. Kind of a dubious distinction. Conan stared with burning interest at his masked companions. One of them was Thutothums, or else the destination of the band was a rendezvous with the man he sought. And he knew what that destination was, when beyond the palms he glimpsed a black triangular bulk looming against the shadowy sky. They passed through the belt of huts and groves, and if any man saw them he was careful not to show himself. The huts were dark. Behind them, the black towers of Kimi rose gloomily against the stars that were mirrored in the waters of the harbor. Ahead of them, the desert stretched away in dim darkness. Somewhere a jackal yipped. The quick-passing sandals of the silent neophytes made no noise in the sand. They might have been ghosts, moving toward that colossal pyramid that rose out of the murk of the desert. There was no sound over all the sleeping land. Conan's heart beat quicker as he gazed at the grim black wedge that stood etched against the stars, and his impatience to close with Thutothums in whatever conflict the meeting might mean was not unmixed with a fear of the unknown. No man could approach one of those somber piles of black stone without apprehension. The very name was a symbol of repellent horror among the northern nations, and legends hinted that the Stygians did not build them, that they were in the land at whatever immeasurably ancient date the Stygian people came into the land of the great river. As they approached the pyramid, he glimpsed a dim glow near the base, which presently resolved itself into a doorway, on either side of which brooded stone lions with the heads of women, cryptic, inscrutable nightmares crystallized in stone. The leader of the band made straight for the doorway, in the deep well of which Conan saw a shadowy figure. The leader paused an instant beside this dim figure, and then vanished into the dark interior, and one by one the others followed. As each masked priest passed through the gloomy portal, he was halted briefly by the mysterious guardian, and something passed between them, some word or gesture Conan could not make out. Seeing this, the Cimmerian purposely lagged behind, and stupid, pretended to be fumbling with the fastening of his sandal. Not until the last of the masked figures had disappeared did he straighten and approach the portal. He was uneasily wondering if the guardian of the temple were human, remembering some tales he had heard, but his doubts were set at rest. A dim bronze crescent, glowing just within the door, lightened a narrow corridor that ran away into blackness, and a man standing silent in the mouth of it, wrapped in a wide black cloak. No one else was in sight. Obviously, the masked priests had disappeared down the corridor. Over the cloak that was drawn about his lower features, the Stygian's piercing eyes regarded Conan sharply. With his left hand, he made a curious gesture. On a venture, Conan imitated it, but evidently another gesture was expected. The Stygian's right hand came from under his cloak with a gleam of steel, and his murderous stab would have pierced the heart of an ordinary man. But he was dealing with one whose thews were nerved to the quickness of a jungle cat. Even as the dagger flashed in the dim light, Conan caught the wrist and smashed his clenched right fist against the Stygian's jaw. The man's head went back against the stone wall with a dull crunch that told of a fractured skull. Standing for an instant above him, Conan listened intently. The cresset burned low, casting vague shadows about the door. Nothing stirred in the blackness beyond, though far away and below him, as it seemed, he caught the faint, muffled note of a gong. He stopped and dragged the body behind the great bronze door which stood wide, opened inward, and then the Cimmerian went warily but swiftly down the corridor, toward what doom he did not even try to guess. He had not gone far when he halted, baffled. The corridor split in two branches, and he had no way of knowing which the masked priest had taken. At a venture he chose the left. The floor slanted slightly downward, and was worn smooth as by many feet. Here and there a dim cresset cast a faint, nightmarish twilight. Conan wondered uneasily for what purpose these colossal piles had been reared, in what forgotten age. This was an ancient, ancient land. No man knew how many ages the black temples of Stygia had loomed against the stars. Narrow black arches opened occasionally to right and left, but he kept to the main corridor, although a conviction that he had taken the wrong branch was growing in him. Even with their start on him, he should have overtaken the priests by this time. He was growing nervous. The silence was like a tangible thing, and yet he had a feeling that he was not alone. More than once, passing a nighted arch, he seemed to feel the glare of unseen eyes fixed upon him. He paused, half-minded to turn back to where the corridor had first branched. He wheeled abruptly, knife lifted, every nerve tingling. A girl stood at the mouth of a smaller tunnel, staring fixedly at him. Her skin showed her to be Stygian of some ancient noble family, and like all such women she was tall, lithe, voluptuously Pretty sure lithe and voluptuous contradict one another. Her hair a great pile of black foam, among which gleamed a sparkling ruby. But for her velvet sandals and broad, jewel-encrusted girdle about her supple waist, she was quite nude. "What do you do here?" she demanded. To answer would betray his alien origin. He remained motionless, a grim, somber figure in the hideous mask, with the plumes floating over him. His alert gaze sought the shadows behind her, and found them empty, but there might be hordes of fighting men within her call. She advanced toward him, apparently without apprehension, though with suspicion. "You are not a priest," she said. "You are a fighting man. Even with that mask, that is plain. There is as much difference between you and a priest as there is between a man and a woman." "By Set!" she exclaimed, halting suddenly, her eyes flaring wide. "I do not believe you are even a Stygian." With a movement too quick for the eye to follow, his hand closed about her round throat, lightly as a caress. "Not a sound out of you," he muttered. Her smooth flesh was cold as marble, yet there was no fear in the wide, dark, marvelous eyes which regarded him. "Do not fear," she answered calmly. "I will not betray you. But are you mad to come, a stranger and a foreigner, to the forbidden temple of Set?" "I'm looking for the priest Thutothoms," he answered. "Is he in this temple?" "Why do you seek him?" she parried. "He has something of mine which was stolen." "I will lead you to him," she volunteered, so promptly that his suspicions were instantly roused. "Don't play with me, girl," he growled. "I do not play with you. I have no love for Thutothoms." He hesitated, then made up his mind. After all, he was as much in her power as she was in his. "Walk beside me," he commanded, shifting his grasp from her throat to her wrist. "But walk with care. If you make a suspicious move—" She led him down the slanting corridor, down and down, until there were no more cressets, and he groped his way in darkness, aware less by sight than by feel and sense of the woman by his side. Once, when he spoke to her, she turned her head toward him, and he was startled to see her eyes glowing like golden fire in the dark. Dim doubts and vague, monstrous suspicions haunted his mind, but he followed her, through a labyrinthine maze of black corridors that confused even his primitive sense of direction. He mentally cursed himself for a fool, allowing himself to be led into that black abode of mystery. But it was too late to turn back now. Again, he felt life and movement in the darkness about him, sensed peril and hunger burning impatiently in the blackness. Unless his ears deceived him, he caught a faint sliding noise that ceased and receded at a muttered command from the girl. She led him at last into a chamber lighted by a curious 7-branched candelabrum in which black candles burned weirdly. He knew that they were far below the earth. The chamber was square, with walls and ceiling of polished black marble, and furnished after the manner of the ancient Stygians. There was a couch of ebony covered with black velvet, and on a black stone dais lay a carven mummy case. Conan stood waiting expectantly, staring at the various black arches which opened into the chamber. But the girl made no move to go farther. Stretching herself on the couch with feline suppleness, she intertwined her fingers behind her sleek head and regarded him from under long, drooping lashes. "Well," he demanded impatiently, "what are you doing? Where's Thutotham's?" "There's no haste," she answered lazily. "What is an hour, or a day, or a year, or a century, for that matter? Take off your mask. Let me see your features." With a grunt of annoyance, Conan dragged off the bulky headpiece, and the girl nodded as if in approval as she scanned his dark, scarred face and blazing eyes. "There's strength in you, great strength. You could strangle a bullock." He moved restlessly, his suspicion growing. With his hand on his hilt, he peered into the gloomy arches. "If you've brought me into a trap," he said, "you won't live to enjoy your handiwork. Are you going to get off that couch and do as you promised? Or do I have to?" His voice trailed away. He was staring at the mummy case, on which the countenance of the occupant was carved in ivory with the startling vividness of a forgotten art. There was a disquieting familiarity about that carven mask, and with something of a shock, he realized what it was. There was a startling resemblance between it and the face of the girl lolling on the ebon couch. She might have been the model from which it was carved, but he knew the portrait was at least centuries old. Archaic hieroglyphics were scrawled across the lacquered lid, and seeking back into his mind for tag ends of learning, he picked up here and there incidentals of an adventurous life. He spelled them out and said aloud, "Akivasha." "You have heard of Princess Akivasha?" inquired the girl on the couch. "Who hasn't?" he grunted. The name of that ancient, evil, beautiful princess still lived the world over in song and legend, though 10,000 years had rolled their cycles since the daughter of Tuthamon had reveled in purple feasts amid the black halls of ancient Luxor. Her only sin was that she loved life and all the meanings of life, said the Stygian girl. To win life she courted death. She could not bear to think of growing old and shriveled and worn, and dying at last as hags die. She wooed darkness like a lover, and his gift was life, life that, not being life as mortals know it, can never grow old and fade. She went into the shadows to cheat age and death. Conan glared at her with eyes that were suddenly burning slits, and he wheeled and tore the lid from the sarcophagus. It was empty. Behind him, the girl was laughing, and the sound froze the blood in his veins. He whirled back to her, the short hairs on his neck bristling. "You are Akivasha," he grated. She laughed and shook back her burnished locks, spread her arms sensuously. "I am Akivasha. I am the woman who never died, who never grew old. What fools say was lifted from the earth by the gods, in the full bloom of her youth and beauty, to queen it forever in some celestial clime. Nay, it is in the shadows that mortals find immortality. 10,000 years ago I died to live forever. Give me your lips, strong man." Rising lightly, she came to him, rose on tiptoe, and flung her arms about his massive neck. Scowling down into her upturned, beautiful countenance, he was aware of a fearful fascination and an icy fear. "Love me," she whispered, her head thrown back, her eyes closed and lips parted. "Give me of your blood to renew my youth and perpetuate my everlasting life. I will make you, too, immortal." So she's a vampire. I will teach you the wisdom of all the ages, all the secrets that have lasted out the eons in the blackness beneath these dark temples. I will make you king of that shadowy horde which revels among the tombs of the ancients when night veils the desert and bats flit across the moon. I am weary of priests and magicians and captive girls dragged screaming through the portals of death. I desire a man. Love me, barbarian. She pressed her dark head down against his mighty breast, and he felt a sharp pang at the base of his throat. With a curse, he tore her away and flung her sprawling across the couch. Damned vampire! Blood was trickling from a tiny wound in his throat. She reared up on the couch like a serpent poised to strike, all the golden fires of hell blazing in her wide eyes. Her lips drew back, revealing white, pointed teeth. Fool, she shrieked. Do you think to escape me? You will live and die in darkness. I have brought you far below the temple. You can never find your way out alone. You can never cut your way through those which guard the tunnels. But for my protection, the sons of Set would long ago have taken you into their bellies. Fool, I shall drink yet your blood. Of course she's a vampire. Keep away from me, or I'll slash you asunder, he grunted, his flesh crawling with revulsion. You may be immortal, but steel will dismember you. Anybody know what the vampire queen's name was in Anne Rice's vampire novels? Keep away from me, or I'll slash you asunder, he grunted, his flesh crawling with revulsion. You may be immortal, but steel will dismember you. Akivasha, it's pretty close. As he backed toward the arch through which he had entered, the light went out suddenly. All the candles were extinguished at once, though he did not know how, for Akivasha had not touched them. But the vampire's laugh rose mockingly behind him, poison sweet as the viols of hell, and he sweated as he groped in the darkness for the arch in a near panic. His fingers encountered an opening, and he plunged through it. Whether it was the arch through which he had entered, he did not know, nor did he very much care. His one thought was to get out of the haunted chamber, which had housed that beautiful, hideous, undead fiend for so many centuries. His wanderings through those black, winding tunnels were a sweating nightmare. Behind him and about him, he heard faint slitherings and glidings, and once the echo of that sweet, hellish laughter he had heard in the chamber of Akivasha. He slashed ferociously at sounds and movements he heard, or imagined he heard in the darkness near him, and once his sword cut through some yielding, tenuous substance that might have been cobwebs. He had a desperate feeling that he was being played with, lured deeper and deeper into ultimate night, before being set upon by demoniac talon and fang. And through his fear ran the sickening revulsion of his discovery. The legend of Akivasha was so old, and among the evil tales told of her ran a thread of beauty and idealism, of everlasting youth. To so many dreamers and poets and lovers, she was not alone the evil princess of Stygian legend, but the symbol of eternal youth and beauty, shining forever in some far realm of the gods. And this was the hideous reality. This foul perversion was the truth of that everlasting life. Through his physical revulsion ran the sense of a shattered dream of man's idolatry. Its glittering gold proved slime and cosmic filth. A wave of futility swept over him, a dim fear of the falseness of all men's dreams and idolatries. And now he knew that his ears were not playing him tricks. He was being followed, and his pursuers were closing in on him. In the darkness sounded shufflings and slidings that were never made by human feet. No, nor by the feet of any normal animal. The underworld had its bestial life too, perhaps. They were behind him. He turned to face them, though he could see nothing, and slowly backed away. Then the sound ceased, even before he turned his head and saw, somewhere down the long corridor, a glow of light. All right, that's the end of the chapter, so we'll take a quick break here. I'm going to warm up my tea. If you guys need to take a break or warm up your drinks or whatever, take a moment now. If If you want to stay in chat, that's awesome too. Or if you want to ask a couple questions of Mr. 8-Ball. I'm sure he's in fine snarky form today. It doesn't. It could be miss or it or them or they or any pronoun you prefer. Is there a particular reason it shouldn't be? I don't know. I found snark to be rather equal opportunity amongst the genders. I think snark is more of a human characteristic than anything else. Although Conan gets snarky sometimes, so maybe snark is more a characteristic of living things rather than just humans. I know 8-Ball's snark is inherited, as it does not generate its own words. Oh, man. So, I'm going to start the questions for a giveaway on the first stream after the year turns. Anything that any stream that has occurred from the start till now, or till the first, will be will be eligible for the questions this time. And then for the giveaway in February, it'll be any stream in January. And so on and so forth like that. You do not have to listen to the stream live to participate. You don't have to subscribe. You don't have to do anything except contact me with the question and the answer. And correct answers will get 1 point. Most points by the end of the month will win the giveaway. And we'll figure out a way to sort out ties. The Discord is a good way to contact me, though. So, yeah, please do join the Discord for the giveaway and contact me through a Discord message. That would be the best way. I cannot promise to get your entries if you do the Twitch Whisper, but I will try. So, yep, if you're enjoying it, if you want to participate in the giveaway, whatever, join the Discord. And, yeah. The older streams are all available on the YouTube channel. So if you need to go back and review or do, because I'm kind of planning these to be like sort of scavenger hunt questions. So when I ask them, please do not answer them in the chat. If you answer them in the chat, I'll have to do a different question. Because, don't want other people to be able to see those answers right or wrong. You can't ask clarifying questions if you don't understand quite what I'm asking, though. But these should be fairly clear and straightforward questions. And then the giveaway will probably be one of the games that we sometimes play among the community on Steam. Your answer will always be the same? Okay. Are you mad because I disqualified you? I'm recruiting you to help me come up with the questions, so. But I think it ought to be fun. Your answer is always purple. I mean, I suppose one of the questions could be, what's Vela's favorite color? That would be an awfully easy question, though. And you definitely count. You always count. Wow, the snark on that one. Yeah, I said anything to do with the streams. I mean, honestly, this could be, what is the picture on the 4th stream I ever did? Could be a question. Like I said, these are going to be kind of scavenger hunt. So it's not just questions from the stories. Yep, 8-Ball says you're boring. Not interested at all. Eight Ball's a snarky bastard. Well, good. I'm glad you like the scavenger hunts. But let's go ahead and go back to the story. Everybody back. All right. Chapter 19, in the Hall of the Dead. Conan moved cautiously in the direction of the light he had seen, his ear cocked over his shoulder. But there was no further sound of pursuit, though he felt the darkness pregnant with sentient life. The glow was not stationary. It moved, bobbing grotesquely along. Then he saw the source. The tunnel he was traversing crossed another, wider corridor some distance ahead of him, and along this tunnel filed a bizarre procession. 4 tall, gaunt men in black hooded robes, leaning on staves. The leader held a torch over his head, a torch that burned with a curious, steady glow. Like phantoms, they passed across his limited range of vision and vanished, with only a faint, fading glow to tell of their passing. Their appearance was indescribably eldritch. They were not Stygians, not like anything Conan had ever seen. He doubted if they were even humans. They were like black ghosts stalking ghoulishly along the haunted tunnels. But his position could be no more desperate than it was. Before the inhuman feet behind him could resume their slithering advance at the fading of the distant illumination, Conan was running down the corridor. He plunged into the other tunnel and saw, far down it, small in the distance, the weird procession moving in the glowing sphere. He stole noiselessly after them, then shrank back suddenly against the wall as he saw them halt and cluster together, as if conferring on some matter. They turned as if to retrace their steps, and he slipped into the nearest archway. Groping in the darkness to which he had become so accustomed that he could all but see through it, he discovered that the tunnel did not run straight, but meandered, and he fell back beyond the first turn so that the light of the strangers should not fall on him as they passed. I mean, that was more like a burp than words are hard, but okay. But as he stood there, he was aware of a low hum of sound from somewhere behind him, like the murmur of human voices. Moving down the corridor in that direction, he confirmed his first suspicion. Abandoning his original intention of following the ghoulish travelers to whatever destination might be theirs, he set out in the direction of the voices. Presently, he saw a glint of light ahead of him, and turning into the corridor from which it issued, saw a broad arch filled with a dim glow at the other end. On his left, a narrow stone stair went upward. An instinctive caution prompted him to turn and mount the stair. The voices he heard were coming from beyond that flame-filled arch. The sounds fell away beneath him as he climbed, and presently he came out through a low arched door into a vast open space, glowing with a weird radiance. He was standing on a shadowy gallery from which he looked down into a broad, dim-lit hall of colossal proportions. It was a hall of the dead, which few ever see but the silent priests of Stygia. Along the black walls rose tier above tier of carven, painted sarcophagi. Each stood in a niche in the dusky stone, and the tiers mounted up and up to be lost in the gloom above. Thousands of carven masks stared impassively down upon the group in the midst of the hall, rendered futile and insignificant by that vast array of the dead. Of this group, 10 were priests, and though they had discarded their masks, Conan knew that they were the priests he had accompanied to the pyramid. They stood before a tall, hawk-faced man beside a black altar on which lay a mummy in rotting swathings. And the altar seemed to stand in the heart of a living fire which pulsed and shimmered, dripping flakes of quivering golden flame on the black stones about it. This dazzling glow emanated from a great red jewel which lay upon the altar, and in the reflection of which the faces of the priests looked ashy and corpse-like. As he looked, "Hey, Audigy, thanks for the follow. Didn't know you were in here. Also, scared the heck out of me. That alert was super loud on my headset." All right. As he looked, Conan felt the pressure of all the weary leagues and the weary nights and days of his long quest, and he trembled with the mad urge to rush among those silent priests. No worries. It's all right. I should have heard the alert sound. Weird. I'll play with the settings after the stream. Did you guys at least see the GIF of the owl in the books? Okay, so we got that. So it's just a volume issue. Okay, I'm sure I've got something borked in Streamlabs. And he trembled with the mad urge to rush among the silent priests, clear his way with mighty blows of naked steel, and grasp the red gem with passion-taut fingers. But he gripped himself with iron control, and crouched down in the shadow of the stone balustrade. A glance showed him that a stair led down into the hall from the gallery, hugging the wall and half hidden in the shadows. He glared into the dimness of the vast place, seeking other priests or votaries, but saw only the group about the altar. In that great emptiness, the voice of the man beside the altar sounded hollow and ghostly. And so the word came southward. The night wind whispered it, the ravens croaked of it as they flew, and the grim bats told it to the owls and the serpents that lurk in hoary ruins. Werewolf and vampire knew, and the ebon-bodied demons that prowl by night. The sleeping night of the world stirred and shook its heavy mane, and there began a throbbing of drums in deep darkness, and the echoes of far weird cries frightened men who walked by dusk. For the heart of Ahriman had come again into the world to fulfill its cryptic destiny. Ask me not how I, Thutothoms of Kimi in the night, heard the word before Thoth-Amon, who calls himself prince of all wizards. There are secrets not meet for such ears even as yours, and Thoth-Amon is not the only lord of the Black Ring. I knew, and I went to meet the heart which came southward. It was like a magnet which drew me, unerringly. From death to death it came, riding on a river of human blood. Blood feeds it, blood draws it. Its power is greatest when there is blood on the hands that grasp it, when it is wrested by slaughter from his holder. Wherever it gleams, blood is spilt and kingdoms totter, and the forces of nature are put in turmoil. And here I stand, the master of the heart, and have summoned you to come secretly, who are faithful to me, to share in the black kingdom that shall be. Tonight you shall witness the breaking of Thothamon's chains which enslave us, and the birth of empire. Who am I, even I, Thutothims, to know what powers lurk and dream in those crimson deeps? It holds secrets forgotten for 3,000 years, but I shall learn. These shall tell me. He waved his hand toward the silent shapes that lined the hall. See how they sleep, staring through their carven masks. Kings, queens, generals, priests, wizards, the dynasties and nobility of Stygia for 10,000 years. The touch of the heart will awaken them from their long slumber. Long, long the heart throbbed and pulsed in ancient Stygia. Here was its home in the centuries before it journeyed to Acheron. The ancients knew its full power, and they will tell me when by its magic I restore them to life to labor for me. All right, so he's going to form his empire by bringing back all the past leaders of his country. I see nothing possibly going wrong with that. Nothing at all. Let's just awaken 10,000 years of supreme leaders and then tell them they all work for you. Good plan. Yep, good plan there. Solid amount of thinking went into that. I will rouse them, will waken them, will learn their forgotten wisdom, the knowledge locked in those withered skulls. By the lore of the dead we shall enslave the living. Aye, kings and generals and wizards of old shall be our helpers and our slaves. Who shall stand before us? Look, this dried, shriveled thing on the altar was once Thoth McCree, a high priest of Set, who died 3,000 years ago. He was an adept of the Black Ring. He knows of the heart. He will tell us of its powers. Lifting the great jewel, the speaker laid it on the withered breast of the mummy, and lifted his hand as he began an incantation. But the incantation was never finished. With his hand lifted and his lips parted, he froze, glaring past his acolytes, and they wheeled to stare in the direction in which he was looking. Through the black arch of a door, 4 gaunt, black-robed shapes had filed into the great hall. Their faces were dim yellow ovals in the shadow of their hoods. "Who are you?" ejaculated Thutothims, in a voice as pregnant with danger as the hiss of a cobra. "Are you mad to invade the holy shrine of Set?" The tallest of the strangers spoke, and his voice was toneless as a Khitan temple bell. "We follow Conan of Aquilonia." "He is not here," answered Thutothims, shaking back his mantle from his right hand with a curious menacing gesture, like a panther unsheathing his talons. "You lie. He is in this temple. We tracked him from a corpse behind the bronze door of the outer portal through a maze of corridors. We were following his devious trail when we became aware of this conclave. We go now to take it up again. But first, give us the heart of Ahriman." "Death is the portion of madmen," murmured Thutothims, moving nearer the speaker. His priests closed in on cat-like feet, but the strangers did not appear to heed. "Who can look on it without desire?" said the Khitan. "In Kitai we have heard of it. It will give us power over the people which cast us out. Glory and wonder dream in its crimson depths. Give it to us before we slay you." A fierce cry rang out as a priest leaped with a flicker of steel. Before he could strike, a scaly staff licked out and touched his breast, and he fell as a dead man falls. In an instant, the mummies were staring down on a scene of blood and horror. Curved knives flashed and crimsoned. Snaky staffs licked in and out. Snaky staffs. Okay. And whenever they touched a man, that man screamed and died. You know, if I was following a serpent god, I think I would expect to be immune to poison. Right? I mean, if I'm a high priest in a world where magic really works and the god actually gives you blessings and whatnot, immunity to poison seems like it would be high on the list of things. At the first stroke, Conan had bounded up and was racing down the stairs. He caught only glimpses of that brief, fiendish fight, saw men swaying, locked in battle and streaming blood, saw one Catan fairly hacked to pieces, yet still on his feet and dealing death, when Thuthothim smote him on the breast with his open, empty hand, and he dropped dead, though naked steel had not been enough to destroy his uncanny vitality. By the time Conan's hurtling feet left the stair, the fight was all but over. 3 of the Catans were down, slashed and cut to ribbons and disemboweled, but of the Stygians, only Thuthothim's remained on his feet. He rushed at the remaining Catan, his empty hand lifted like a weapon, and that hand was as black as night. But before he could strike, the staff in the tall Catan's hand licked out, seeming to elongate itself as the yellow man thrust. The point touched the bosom of Thuthothim's, and he staggered. Again and yet again the staff licked out, and Thuthothim's reeled and fell dead, his features blotted out in a rush of blackness that made the whole of him the same hue as his enchanted hand. Yep, grab the jewel and go. The Catan turned toward the jewel that burned on the breast of the mummy, but Conan was before him. In a tense stillness, the two faced each other, amid that shambles, with the carven mummies staring down upon them. "Far have I followed you, O king of Aquilonia," said the Catan calmly. "Down the long river, and over the mountains, across Poitain and Zingara, and through the hills of Argos and down the coast. Not easily did we pick up your trail from Tarantia, for the priests of Asura are crafty. We lost it in Zingara, but we found your helmet in the forest below the border hills, where you had fought with the ghouls of the forests. Almost we lost the trail again tonight among these labyrinths." Conan reflected that he had been fortunate in returning from the vampire's chamber by another route than that which he had been led to. Otherwise, he would have run full into these yellow fiends, instead of sighting them from afar as they smelled out his spoor like human bloodhounds, with whatever uncanny gift was theirs. The Catan shook his head slightly as if reading his mind. "That is meaningless. The long trail ends here." "Why have you hounded me?" demanded Conan, poised to move in any direction with the celerity of a hair trigger. "It was a debt to pay," answered the Catan. "To you, who are about to die, I will not withhold knowledge. We were vassals of the king of Aquilonia, Valerius. Long we served him, but of that service we are free now. My brothers by death, and I by the fulfillment of obligation. I shall return to Aquilonia with 2 hearts. For myself, the heart of Ahriman. For Valerius, the heart of Conan. A kiss of the staff that was cut from the living tree of death." The staff licked out like the dart of a viper, but the slash of Conan's knife was quicker. The staff fell in writhing halves. There was another flicker of the keen steel like a jet of lightning, and the head of the Catan rolled to the floor. Conan wheeled and extended his hand toward the jewel. Then he shrank back, his hair bristling, his blood congealing icily. For no longer a withered brown thing lay on the altar. The jewel shimmered on the full, arching breast of a naked living man who lay among the moldering bandages. Living? Conan could not decide. The eyes were like dark, murky glass, under which shone inhuman, somber fires. Another vampire, maybe? Slowly the man rose, taking the jewel in his hand. He towered beside the altar, dark, naked, with a face like a carven image. Mutely he extended his hand toward Conan, with the jewel throbbing like a living heart within it. Conan took it, with an eerie sensation of receiving gifts from the hand of the dead. He somehow realized that the proper incantations had not been made. The conjurement had not been completed. Life had not been fully restored to his corpse. "Who are you?" demanded the Cimmerian. The answer came in a toneless monotone, like the dripping of water from stalactites in subterranean caverns. "I was Thoth McCree. I am dead." "Will you lead me out of this accursed temple? Will you?" Conan requested, his flesh crawling. With measured mechanical steps, the dead man moved toward a black arch. Conan followed him. A glance back showed him once again the vast, shadowy hall, with its tiers of sarcophagi, the dead men sprawled about the altar, The head of the Khitan he had slain stared sightless up at the sweeping shadows. The glow of the jewel illuminated the black tunnels like an ensorcelled lamp dripping golden fire. Once, Conan caught a glimpse of ivory flesh in the shadows, believed he saw the vampire that was Akivasha shrinking back from the glow of the jewel, and with her, other less human shapes scuttled or shambled into the darkness. The dead man strode straight on, looking neither to the right nor left, his pace as changeless as the tramp of doom. Cold sweat gathered thick on Conan's flesh. Icy doubts assailed him. How could he know that this terrible figure out of the past was leading him to freedom? But he knew that, left to himself, he could never untangle this bewitched maze of corridors and tunnels. He followed his awful guide through the blackness that loomed before and behind them, and was filled with skulking shapes of horror and lunacy that cringed from the blinding glow of the heart. Then the bronze doorway was before him, and Conan felt the night wind blowing across the desert, and saw the stars and the starlit desert across which streamed the great black shadow of the pyramid. Thoth McCree pointed silently into the desert, and then turned and stalked soundlessly back in the darkness. Conan stared after that silent figure that receded into the blackness on soundless, inexorable feet, as one that moves to a known and inevitable doom, or returns to everlasting sleep. With a curse, the Cimmerian leaped from the doorway and fled into the desert, as if pursued by demons. He did not look back toward the pyramid, or toward the black towers of Kimi looming dimly across the sands. He headed southward toward the coast, and he ran as a man runs in ungovernable panic. The violent exertion shook his brain free of black cobwebs. The clean desert wind blew the nightmares from his soul, and his revulsion changed to a wild tide of exultation before the desert gave way to a tangle of swampy growth through which he saw the black water lying before him, and the venturer at anchor. He plunged through the undergrowth, hip deep in the marshes, dived headlong into the deep water, heedless of sharks or crocodiles, and swam to the galley, and was clambering up the chain onto the deck, dripping and exultant before the watch saw him. "Awake, you dogs!" roared Conan, knocking aside the spear the startled lookout thrust at his breast. "Heave up the anchor! Lay to the doors! Give that fisherman a helmet full of gold and put him ashore. Darkness will soon be breaking, and before sunrise we must be racing for the nearest port of Zingara." He whirled about his head the great jewel, which threw off splashes of light that spotted the deck with golden fire. Chapter 20. You still here, Odygy? Is this your first time catching the stream? Hope you're liking it okay if you're here. Chapter 20. Out of the dust shall Acheron arise. Winter had passed from Aquilonia. Leaves sprang out on the limbs of trees, and the fresh grass smiled to the touch of the warm southern breezes. But many a field lay idle and empty. Many a charred heap of ashes marked the spot where proud villas or prosperous towns had stood. Wolves prowled openly along the green grass-grown highways, and bands of gaunt, masterless men slunk through the forests. Only in Tarantia was feasting and wealth and pageantry. Valerius ruled like one touched with madness. Even many of the barons who had welcomed his return cried out at last against him. His tax-gatherers crushed rich and poor alike. The wealth of a looted kingdom poured into Tarantia, which became less like the capital of a realm than the garrison of conquerors in a conquered land. Its merchants waxed rich, but it was a precarious prosperity, for none knew when he might be accused of treason on a trumped-up charge, and his property confiscated, himself cast into prison or brought to the bloody block. Valerius made no attempt to conciliate his subjects. He maintained himself by means of the Numidian soldiery and by desperate mercenaries. He knew himself to be a puppet of Almeric. He knew that he ruled only on the sufferance of the Numidian. He knew that he could never hope to unite Aquilonia under his rule and cast off the yoke of his masters, for the outland provinces would resist him to the last drop of blood. And for that matter, The Numidians would cast him from his throne if he made any attempt to consolidate his kingdom. He was caught in his own vice. The gall of defeated pride corroded his soul, and he threw himself into a reign of debauchery, as one who lives from day to day, without thought or care for tomorrow. Yet there was a subtlety in his madness, so deep that not even Almeric guessed it. Perhaps the wild, chaotic years of wandering as an exile had bred in him a bitterness beyond common conception. Perhaps his loathing of his present position increased this bitterness to a kind of madness. At any event, he lived with one desire, to cause the ruin of all who associated with him. He knew that his rule would be over the instant he had served Almeric's purpose. He knew, too, that so long as he continued to oppress his native kingdom, the Numidian would suffer him to reign, for Almeric wished to crush Aquilonia into ultimate submission, to destroy its last shred of independence, and then, at last, to seize it himself, rebuild it after his own fashion with his vast wealth, and use its men and natural resources to wrest the crown of Numidia from Tarascus. For the throne of an emperor was Almeric's ultimate ambition, and Valerius knew it. Valerius did not know whether Tarascus suspected this, but he knew that the king of Numidia approved of his ruthless course. Tarascus hated Aquilonia, with a hate born of old wars. He desired only the destruction of the western kingdom. And Valerius intended to ruin the country so utterly that not even Almeric's wealth could ever rebuild it. He hated the Baron quite as much as he hated the Aquilonians, and hoped only to live to see the day when Aquilonia lay in utter ruin, and Tarascus and Almeric were locked in a hopeless civil war that would have completely destroyed Numidia. He believed that the conquest of the still defiant provinces of Gunderland and Poitain and the Bosonian marches would mark his end as king. He would then have served Almeric's purpose and could be discarded. So he delayed the conquest of these provinces, confining his activities to objectless raids and forays, meeting Almeric's urges for action with all sorts of plausible objections and postponements. His life was a series of feasts and wild debauches. He filled his palace with the fairest girls of the kingdom. He blasphemed the gods and sprawled drunken on the floor of the banquet hall, wearing the golden crown and staining his royal purple robes with the wine he spilled. In gusts of bloodlust he festooned the gallows in the market square with dangling corpses, glutted the axes of the headsmen, and sent his Numidian horsemen thundering through the lands, pillaging and burning. Driven to madness, the land was in a constant upheaval of frantic revolt, savagely suppressed. Valerius plundered and looted and destroyed until even Almeric protested, warning him that he would beggar the kingdom beyond repair, not knowing that such was his fixed determination. But while in both Aquilonia and Numidia men talked of the madness of the king, in Numidia men talked much of Zaltatun, the masked one. Yet few saw him on the streets of Belverus. Men said he spent much time in the hills, in curious conclaves with surviving remnants of an old race, dark, silent folk who claimed descent from an ancient kingdom. Men whispered of drums beating far up in the dreaming hills, of fires glowing in the darkness, and strange chantings borne on the winds, chantings and rituals forgotten centuries ago except as meaningless formulas mumbled beside mountain hearths in villages whose inhabitants differed strangely from the people of the valleys. The reason for these conclaves none knew, unless it was Orestes, who frequently accompanied the Pathonian, and on whose countenance a haggard shadow was growing. But in the full flood of spring, a sudden whisper passed over the sinking kingdom that woke the land to eager life. It came like a murmurous wind drifting up from the south. Waking men sunk in the apathy of despair. Yet how it first came none could truly say. Some spoke of a strange, grim old woman who came down from the mountains with her hair flowing in the wind, and a great gray wolf following her like a dog. Others whispered of the priests of Asura, who stole like furtive phantoms from Gunderland to the marches of Poitain and to the forest villages of the Bosonians. However word came, revolt ran like a flame along the borders. Outlying Numidian garrisons were stormed and put to the sword. Foraging parties were cut to pieces. The West was up in arms, and there was a different air about the rising, a fierce resolution and inspired wrath, rather than the frantic despair that had motivated the preceding revolts. It was not only the common people. Barons were fortifying their castles and hurling defiance at the governors of the provinces. Bands of Bessonians were seen moving among the edges of the marches, stocky, resolute men in brigandines and steel caps, with longbows in their hands. From the inert stagnation of dissolution and ruin, the realm was suddenly alive, vibrant, and dangerous. So Almeric sent in haste for Tarascus, who came with an army. In the royal palace in Tarantia, the two kings and Almeric discussed the rising. They had not sent for Zaltatun, immersed in his cryptic studies in the Numidian hills. Not since that bloody day in the valley of the Valkia had they called upon him for aid of his magic, and he had drawn apart, communing but little with them, apparently indifferent to their intrigues. Nor had they sent for Orestes, but he came, and he was white as spume blown before the storm. He stood in the gold-domed chamber where the kings held conclave, and he beheld in amazement his haggard stare, the fear they had never guessed the mind of Orestes could hold. "You are weary, Orestes," said Almeric. "Sit upon this divan, and I will have a slave fetch you wine. You have ridden hard." Orestes waved aside the invitation. "I have killed 3 horses on the road from Belverus. I cannot drink wine. I cannot rest until I have said what I have to say." He paced back and forth as if some inner fire would not let him stand motionless, and halting before his wondering companions. "When we employed the heart of Ahriman to bring a dead man back to life," Orestes said abruptly, "we did not weigh the consequences of tampering in the black dust of the past. The fault is mine, and the sin. We thought only of our ambitions, forgetting what ambitions this man might himself have, and we have loosed a demon upon the earth, a fiend inexplicable to common humanity. I have plumbed deep in evil, but there is a limit to which I, or any man of my age, can go. My ancestors were clean men, without any demoniacal taint. It is only I who have sunk into the pits, and I can sin only to the extent of my personal individuality. But behind Zaltatun lie 1,000 centuries of black magic and diabolism, an ancient tradition of evil. He is beyond our conception, not only because he is a wizard himself, but also because he is the son of a race of wizards. I have seen things that have blasted my soul. In the heart of the slumbering hills, I have watched Zaltatun commune with the souls of the damned, and invoke the ancient demons of forgotten Acheron. I have seen the accursed descendants of that accursed... I think you should pick a new word. I have seen the accursed descendants of that accursed empire worship him and hail him as their arch-priest. I have seen what he plots, and I tell you, it is no less than the restoration of the ancient, black, grisly kingdom of Acheron. What do you mean? Demanded Almeric. Acheron is dust. There are not enough survivals to make an empire. Not even Zaltatun can reshape the dust of 3,000 years. You know little of his black powers, answered Orestes grimly. I have seen the very hills take on an alien and ancient aspect under the spell of his incantations. I have glimpsed, like shadows behind the realities, the dim shapes and outlines of valleys, forests, mountains, and lakes that are not as they are today, but as they were in that dim yesterday. I have even sensed, rather than glimpsed, the purple towers of forgotten Python, shimmering like figures of mist in the dusk. And in the last conclave to which I accompanied him, understanding of his sorcery came to me at last, while the drums beat and the beast-like worshippers howled with their heads in the dust. I tell you, he would restore Acheron by his magic, by the sorcery of a gigantic blood sacrifice such as the world has never seen. He would enslave the world, and with a deluge of blood, wash away the present and restore the past. You're mad, exclaimed Tarascus. Mad, Orestes? Orestes turned a haggard stare upon him. Can any man see what I have seen and remain wholly sane? Yet I speak the truth. He plots the return of Acheron, with its towers and wizards and kings and horrors, as it was in the long ago. The descendants of Acheron will serve him as a nucleus upon which to build. But it is the blood and the bodies of the people of the world today that will furnish the mortar and the stones for rebuilding. I cannot tell you how. My own brain reels when I try to understand. But I have seen. Acheron will be Acheron again, and even the hills, the forests, and the rivers will resume their ancient aspect. Why not? If I, with my tiny store of knowledge, could bring to life a man dead 3,000 years, why cannot the greatest wizard of the world bring back to life a kingdom dead 3,000 years? Out of the dust shall Acheron arise at his bidding. How can we thwart him? Asked Tarascus, impressed. There is but one way, answered Orestes. We must steal the heart of Ahriman. But I, began Tarascus involuntarily, then closed his mouth quickly. None had noticed him, and Orestes was continuing. It is a power that can be used against him. With it in my hands, I might defy him. But how shall we steal it? He has it hidden in some secret place, from which not even a Zamorian thief might filch it. I cannot learn its hiding place. If he would only sleep again the sleep of the Black Lotus. But the last time he slept thus was after the battle of the Valkyria, when he was weary because of the great magic he had performed, and... The door was locked and bolted, but it swung silently open, and Zaltatun stood before them, calm, tranquil, stroking his patriarchal beard, but the lambent lights of hell flickered in his eyes. I have taught you too much, he said calmly, pointing a finger like an index of doom at Orestes. And before any could move, he had cast a handful of dust on the floor near the feet of the priest, who stood like a man turned to marble. It flamed and smoldered. A blue serpentine of smoke rose and swayed upward about Orestes in a slender spiral. And when it had risen above his shoulders, it curled about his neck with a whipping suddenness like the stroke of a snake. Orestes' scream was choked to a gurgle. His hands flew to his neck. His eyes were distended. His tongue protruded. The smoke was like a blue rope about his neck. Then it faded and was gone, and Orestes slumped to the floor, a dead man. Zaltatun smote his hands together, and two men entered, men often observed accompanying him. Small, repulsively dark, with red oblique eyes and pointed, rat-like teeth. They did not speak. Lifting the corpse, they bore it away. Dismissing the matter with a wave of his hands, Zaltatun seated himself at the pale ivory table about which sat the pale kings. Why are you in conclave? He demanded. The Aquilonians have risen in the west, answered Almeric, recovering from the grisly jolt the death of Orestes had given him. The fools believe that Conan is alive and coming at the head of a Poetanian army to reclaim his kingdom. If he had reappeared immediately after Valkyria, or if a rumor had been circulated that he lived, the central provinces would not have risen under him. They feared your powers so. But they have become so desperate under Valerius's misrule that they are ready to follow any man who can unite them against us, and prefer sudden death to torture and continual misery. Of course, the tale has lingered stubbornly in the land that Conan was not really slain at Valkyria, but not until recently have the masses accepted it. But Palantides is back from exile in Ophir, swearing that the king was ill in his tent that day, and that a man-at-arms wore his harness, and a squire, who but recently recovered from the stroke of a mace received at Valkyria, confirms his tale, or pretends to. Excuse me. An old woman with a pet wolf has wandered up and down the land, proclaiming that King Conan yet lives, and will return some day to reclaim the crown. And of late, the cursed priests of Asura sing the same song. They claim that word has come to them by some mysterious means that Conan is returning to reconquer his domain. I cannot catch either her or them. This is, of course, a trick of Trocero's. My spies tell me there is indisputable evidence that the Poetanians are gathering to invade Aquilonia. I believe that Trocero will bring forward some pretender who will claim he is King Conan. Tarascus laughed, but there was no conviction in his laughter. He surreptitiously felt of a scar beneath his jupon, and remembered ravens that cawed on the trail of a fugitive. Remembered the body of his squire, Aridius, brought back from the border mountains horribly mangled by a great grey wolf, his terrified soldiers said. But he also remembered a red jewel stolen from a golden chest while the wizard slept, and he said nothing. And Valerius remembered a dying nobleman who gasped out a tale of fear, and he remembered 4 Khitans who disappeared into the mazes of the south and never returned. But he held his tongue, for hatred and suspicion of his allies aided him like a worm, and he desired nothing so much as to see both rebels and Numidians go down locked in the death grip. But Almeric exclaimed, "It is absurd to dream that Conan lives." For answer, Zaltatun cast a roll of parchment on the table. Almeric caught it up, glared at it. From his lips burst a furious, incoherent cry. He read, "To Zaltatun, grand fakir of Numidia, dog of Acheron, I am returning to my kingdom, and I mean to hang your hide on a bramble. Conan." That's an interesting threat. Don't think I've ever heard of somebody threatening to hang someone on a bramble. "A forgery," exclaimed Almeric. Zaltatun shook his head. "It is genuine. I have compared it with the signature on the royal documents on record in the libraries of the court. None could imitate that bold scrawl." "Then if Conan lives," muttered Almeric, "this uprising will not be like the others, for he is the only man living who can unite the Aquilonians." "But," he protested, "this is not like Conan. Why should he put us on our guard with his boasting? One would think that he would strike without warning, after the fashion of the barbarians." "We are already warned," pointed out Zaltatun. "Our spies have told us of preparations for war in Poitain. He could not cross the mountains without our knowledge, so he sends me his defiance in characteristic manner." "Why to you?" demanded Valerius. "Why not to me, or to Tarascus?" Zaltatun turned his inscrutable gaze upon the king. "Conan is wiser than you," he said at last. "He already knows what you kings have yet to learn, that it is not Tarascus, nor Valerius, no, nor Almeric, but Zaltatun who is the real master of the western nations." They did not reply. They sat staring at him, assailed by a numbing realization of the truth of his assertion. "There is no road for me but the imperial highway," said Zaltatun. "But first we must crush Conan. I do not know how he escaped me at Belverus, for knowledge of what happened while I lay in the slumber of the Black Lotus is denied me. But he is in the south gathering an army. It is his last, desperate blow, made possible only by the desperation of the people who have suffered under Valerius. Let them rise. I hold them all in the palm of my hand. We will wait until he moves against us, and then we will crush him once and for all. Then we shall crush Poitain and Gunderland and the stupid Bossonians. After them, Ophir, Argos, Zingara, Koth, all the nations of the world we shall weld into one vast empire. You shall rule as my satraps, and as my captains shall be greater than kings are now. I am unconquerable, for the heart of Ahriman is hidden where no man can ever wield it against me again." Tarascus averted his gaze, lest Zaltatun read his thoughts. He knew the wizard had not looked into the golden chest with its carven serpents that had seemed to sleep since he laid the heart therein. Strange as it seemed, Zaltatun did not know that the heart had been stolen. The strange jewel was beyond or outside the ring of his dark wisdom. His uncanny talents did not warn him that the chest was empty. Tarascus did not believe that Zaltatun knew the full extent of Orestes' revelations, for the Pythonian had not mentioned the restoration of Acheron, but only the building of a new, earthly empire. Tarascus did not believe that Zaltatun was yet quite sure of his power. If they needed his aid in their ambitions, no less he needed theirs. Magic depended, to a certain extent after all, on sword strokes and lance thrusts. The king read meaning in Almeric's furtive gaze. Let the wizard use his arts to help them defeat their most dangerous enemy. Time enough then to turn against him. There might yet be a way to cheat this dark power they had raised. All right, next week we'll pick back up with Chapter 21, The Drums of Peril. Didn't like me leaving off there? A bit of a cliffhanger, was it? Well, I mean, I did offer in the feedback channel the idea of changing the format for the channel, but I didn't get a lot of responses. Because I could just read like one book through each session and then go on to the next one after I finished a book. We would get through books faster, but we wouldn't have as much variety in the streams either. So there's a trade-off. In any case, if you enjoyed the story, whether you're watching now live or on the recording, please click that follow button, join the Discord. We'll be doing our giveaway starting on the 1st. It'll be a kind of a scavenger hunt trivia question thing on stuff that's happened. Anything at all to do with the streams is fair game. So it'll be kind of a scavenger hunt through the old content and stuff like that. Anything from my first stream up until the end of December is fair game for this first one. And thereafter, it'll just be the preceding month that'll be fair game for the questions. And we'll be giving away a game on Steam. Which game will depend on what games you have, but it'll be one of the ones we play as a community. Yep. Although Agatha Christie, most of the rest of her books are not in public domain, so we're going to find another mystery writer for Wednesdays after we finish the current book. So we'll be moving on to a different mystery writer for the midweek mysteries. So if you have any requests for mystery writers, put them in the book request channel as well, please. In any case, let's see. Who is streaming right now? Where was the cackle? I don't cackle. I occasionally do the like evil overlord laugh, you know. You know, like that. Is that better? I don't cackle. You're going to have to find somebody else to cackle if you want to cackle. I don't cackle. And if I ever do cackle and somebody clips it, I shall deny it. Deny it with my, to my last breath. Well, I'm sorry, the timing is off. All right. Well, I could go look for somebody new, or we could raid Ishurna again. I do like her work. What do you think? Ishurna the glass sculptor or somebody new to go and raid? I'm thinking Ishurna. She's doing a Pokemon. Okay. Well, let's go find out what Pokemon she's doing. I almost typed it wrong. All right. And away we go. In 2, 1.